Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Foundry and Google headquarters in Dublin. We're delighted to share a kind of a unique experience with you this evening in celebration of World Whisky Day. So tonight we're going to explore the world of single pot still Irish whiskies, which are all produced at Midleton. And, you know, no better company to have than the five masters of the distillery. So it's something that it's a first for us, because we never had the five masters on stage together at the one time. So if you wouldn't mind putting your hands together and welcoming you on stage, the five masters. So we'll start off with David Quinn, Master of Whisky Science. So following on, we have Brian Nation, Master Distiller. We then have Kevin O'Gorman, Master of Maturation. We have Billy Lighton, Master Blender. And last but not least, we have Ger Buckley, Master Cooper.
I suppose it's fair to say that single pot still Irish whiskey was the biggest selling whiskey category worldwide in the mid-19th century. And then a number of circumstances or events occurred, some of which were inside our control, others which were outside of our control, like prohibition, for instance, that actually led to the demise of single pot still Irish whiskey. So much so that by 1960s, you actually ended up where the demise of single pot still Irish whiskey, but also the growth of Scotch whiskey, and so much so that actually Scotch became synonymous with whiskey, so that people, instead of going into a bar looking for a whiskey, they actually looked for a Scotch.
I suppose there was a seminal moment back in 1966 when the three main families, whiskey-producing families at that time, who were the Jamiesons, the Powers in Dublin, and the Murphys in Cork, who had the Cork Distillers Company, decided to come together and form, what we know today as Irish Distillers. And they came together essentially to save the industry. We were that close to coming to a close, really. And that really started the ball in motion. We built a new distillery down in Midleton that was a bit more modern than the distilleries that they had in Dublin at the time. And around that time as well, in the mid-70s, you had Bushmills came on board. And really that was the way up until about 1987. When Cooley Distillery opened in County Louth. And really, from then up until fairly recently, we've started to see, and particularly in the last 20 years, a major resurgence in interest in Irish whiskey, and in Irish pot still whiskey in particular. So much so that we see maybe at least 15, if not more, new distilleries coming on track. In fact, last week we had the launch of the Vision for Irish Whiskey, and we had all of the current players at that. And to think that from now up to, say, 2020, we're seeing a doubling in sales, a doubling in distillery numbers, or more than that, and a doubling again by 2030.
Single pot still Irish whiskey is really the quintessential whiskey style for Ireland. And, you know, we're lucky that it's still around today, and it's really because of the foresights of the likes of Barry Crockett, my predecessor, and in fact all of our predecessors, that back in the 80s, they had the foresight to lay down stocks of single pot still whiskey so that we can produce the brands of single pot still that we have today. It's actually made from a mash bill of malted barley and unmalted barley. The malted barley that we use is unpeated, so there's no smoky taste off any of our whiskies. And then the unmalted barley imparts a creamy mouthfeel on all of our whiskies. And essentially what we're doing in the brewing process is we're trying to extract the starch from these grains, convert them into fermentable sugars, and then take those fermentable sugars forward to the fermentation to produce a range of alcohol and flavours. And then we come to the distillation process, where we put it through a triple distillation process in copper pot stills. And essentially how that works is that the first pot still is really used to remove all alcohol and flavour from that fermented wash. So we're not really discriminating against the types of flavours that we want in our final distillate or new make spirit at this stage. But when we move forward to our second stage of distillation in the faint still, we actually take what's called a heads cut, a centre cut and a tails cut. It's only the centre cut from the faint still that goes forward to the final distillation known in the spirit still. And here we do exactly the same thing. We take a heads cut, a centre cut and a tails cut. And it's really the heart of the distillate here is the centre cut, which basically goes on for maturation. But that allows us to bring to the fore the spicy characteristics and the fruitiness that we associate with our distillates.
But that third distillation, and if you take a centre cut and take a centre cut of that, you know, sometimes you get asked, aren't you running the risk maybe of losing some flavour? And but the way we do it and the way it's done when Brian takes his cutting strengths, if you take at the third distillation, you're removing more of the fusel oils, fusel alcohols, or the higher alcohols, which tend to be the components in a whiskey spirit that would be responsible essentially for heaviness in the whiskey. So you don't want to lose all of that, but you want to keep some of it for body in the whiskey. But by taking out more than what you would have, say, in a double distilled spirit, it allows some of the other features and characters in the whiskey, principally those that come at the more volatile end, like some of the esters and some of the aldehydes, that will impart more of those characteristic features that we associate with our whiskey, and that would be spiciness, little floral character, and fruitiness that come through in the whiskey, and that's balanced by the remaining body left in the whiskey.
Okay.
And that's in essence what makes triple distilled Irish pot still whiskey unique, or certainly one of the major features of why it makes it unique.
At the moment, we have an apprentice. For the last 2 years. There's an apprentice in Bushman's distillery. The numbers have depleted vastly over 100 years, from about 8,000 or 9,000 down to 4.
4,000.
So you can see how valuable I am.
Is that a pay rise request here? Is it?
But yeah, it is. We are training up an apprentice, and there'll be more to follow. And with the growth, especially in pot still whiskies, there will be a need for coopers in the future. I brought some tools with me and to try and share with everybody. And in my family, we've been coopers for 5 generations now, as you said, well over 200 years. And the beauty about that is everything I do in regards to repairing a barrel or fixing a cask hasn't changed. Hasn't changed for decades, hasn't changed for hundreds of years. And a lot of the tools I have haven't changed in that time either. So it's quite unique to say that I'm probably still working with my grandfather's tools, earning a living. And some of the selection of tools that I brought, and the first one that I kind of show people, and people can get a shock when they see it first, but it's a Cooper's axe, Cooper's broad axe. Wasn't fighting the distillers or anything we were, but so as I say, there are some of the things you must do as a cooper: be able to make your own tools and use them. And last but not least, every cooper had to stand over his work. You couldn't just make a load of barrels, throw them out and hope they hold whiskey. They better hold whiskey because they're going to be in there for 15, 20 years. So you pre-marked your work with a block mark. So a cooper would always work at a block of wood. And for me, my mark that I would put on every cask that was handed down to me from my father, of course, is number 1. I'm sure it was my grandfather's decision. But you can see how well worn that is even. And that's just from hitting on timber. So it takes decades to wear it down. So there are a sample of some of the tools. And like what I always say, that if you don't have a barrel, if you don't have a cask, you don't have any whiskey. So you've got to have a cooper to make the barrel and repair the barrel.
The vast majority, with very little exception, of the casks that we buy in are already seasoned. They're pre-seasoned. When I talk about seasoning, it means that they will have held something else before we put whiskey into them. And out of those, the majority would come from America. So they're coming out of the bourbon business. So whenever we fill a new bourbon cask, that's a B1, that's a first fill. It's already had bourbon. We fill it once with whiskey, and the flavours we would expect to get from a first fill bourbon cask would be, it would have a connection to bourbon. You'll get strong vanilla spiciness, so sweet to that extent. You will also get some charred oak effect. All bourbon barrels are heavily charred on the inside, and that carries over into the whiskey. And I feel as blender that charred oak effect is quite complementary to the spicy nature of the pot still distillate. And then, of course, those casks are used 3 times, so each cycle delivers a little bit of a variation on flavour. We would also take in some casks from Portugal. We have Madeira, Malaga, Marsala, all casks that were traditionally used for whisky maturation.
In terms of quality control, I suppose Billy alluded to it there. I would say one of the most important things is the relationships we've built up with cooperages and sawmills around the world over the last, 30, 40 years. We deal with 3 cooperages in America, Kelvin, Barrels Unlimited and Bluegrass. And we've been working with those guys for well over 30 years. So we have a very long relationship. We have a high specification for our barrels. They understand what we want, and it was really, really important, that relationship in terms of quality. Likewise with Spain, we source a lot of sherry butts, as Billy has said, from Jerez. We trace the wood back to the forest in Galicia. We have close links with the sawmills, and a very close link with Antonio Paez, again going back over probably 30 years. So that's probably the first most important step in terms of quality. Secondly, in sort of more production technical, would be we've 100% inspection when they arrive at Midleton. So, for example, all the American barrels, we have 100% inspection. All the sherry butts, external inspection, and every sherry butt is actually nosed when it arrives at Midleton. And they arrive between November and March every year. So that's the next stage, really, in terms of quality control. And I suppose finally then is the care we take with our barrels in warehouse. All our barrels are stored indoors. That might sound like an obvious thing, but that's really, really important from the quality of the cask. And likewise, our empty casks, we take as much care of our empty casks as our full casks. They're all stored indoors as well, and the only casks you'll see outdoors in Midleton are ones that we're selling off or disposing of. In terms of Ireland, I suppose that we have a particular project which we started 7 or 8 years ago. And by pure coincidence, I have a bottle here. And before I start, there's not one for everyone in the audience. Okay, so just calm down slightly. So maybe just to touch on this in terms of sustainability and quality. As I say, we started this about 7 or 8 years ago. 2 key components from the very start were, first of all, the sustainability of Irish oak. We had to ensure that we had a sustainable supply. And secondly, was the quality of the oak. And the wood compounds that we get from the oak. So we sort of involved a lot of people in this project. We've a forestry consultant, Paddy Purser, who really helped on the sustainability side. And really the picture on Irish oak is very, very good. A lot of planting in the last number of years. And it's only now that really we can start working on Irish oak. In terms of the flavour, tremendous flavour from the Irish oak. We're really pleased with it. It's fast growing. It's lower density. It's higher porosity. And we get really good contribution in terms of maturation. So we're very, very happy with it. Yeah, Dark Whalelock, we obviously did a lot of research back at the start of this in terms of the wood itself. So it's Quercus robur. So it's in America you have Quercus alba typically, Quercus robur in Spain and Quercus robur in Ireland. Now there is other species as well, but our first batch was Quercus robur. So as I said earlier on, it grows faster in Ireland because of the growing season, because of the moisture. So American oak would be more dense, Irish oak less dense, more porous, so you have a more open structure. So that's probably an indication of what's going to happen in terms of maturation. We also did a lot of analysis in terms of the wood compounds. So we found the Irish oak particularly strong in certain compounds. For example, vanillin, vanillic acid, furfural, and these compounds tend to give a lot of sort of caramel, toffee, chocolate, milk chocolate flavours. So when you taste Dark Wheelock, if you haven't tasted it already, it's really very much pronounced. Those beautiful, creamy chocolate, toffee flavours is stunning. So that's sort of the direction it was heading in, and that's quite different and distinct from the Spanish oak, for example, or the American oak.
We pride ourselves at Midleton from the being a single distillery point of view and being able to produce these range of single pot stills. And one of the key things for us is having the flexibility and versatility associated with the distillery. And we achieve the different styles of pot distillates firstly by we can change our mash bill, which is ultimately changing the proportion of malted barley to unmalted barley. And then moving forward into the distillation process, adjusting our cuts from centre to tails during the second distillation and third distillation to ultimately produce an array of different styles of distillates. And if you bring it down to essentially brass taxes and do a comparison between something like a Redbreast and something like Green Spot, the particular style of distillate that goes into Redbreast would be more full-bodied and robust spices coming through with hints of heavier style fruits. And then if you compare that to Green Spot, where we're looking for more lighter spices and sweeter spices coming through, and we are really achieving those from the different cuts from centre to tails in the second and third distillations.
And I think before we finish up, I have one question myself, which is for all of you. But out of all the 5 masters, who is the most important master at the distillery?
How long do you have?
Now, bear in mind, Ger does have an axe nearby, so just be very careful. Right, so everyone, I think that kind of wraps up this evening's session. I hope you enjoyed it, our audience members who are here with us this evening, and then everyone that's watching it live at home. For those of you who would like to learn or know more about Single Pot Still Irish Whiskey, we do have a website, singlepotstill.com, where if you log on, you can be or join our Stillhouse kind of club, so to speak, and get all the latest news, articles about single pot stills, how they're made, and the future products that might be coming out. And also, if any of you ever make the trip down to our distillery in Midleton and you want to get a bit more involved in seeing how it's made, we also have an Irish Whiskey Academy that we do classes from 1 day to 2 days to even 3. So if you ever like to come down and visit us, please do so. We'd love to show you around. And you can get more information on our website, irishwhiskeyacademy.com. So I think for myself and our 5 masters here this evening, it was a pleasure speaking with you and all our guests at home as well. So thank you very much, and take care.